Big Trouble in Little Truck Stop. I am a former teenage prostitute, and I've had many close calls in my line of work, but the one that still haunts me the most happened with a trucker who called himself Jack Burton. The name struck me as odd since it was the same as the protagonist in the movie, Big Trouble in Little China. It was a strange coincidence that would come back to me in the worst way possible. It all started when my pimp made contact with Jack Burton through his CB radio. My pimp had me walk over to his truck in the pouring rain, and I remember how the drops felt like icy needles on my skin. As I got closer to his truck, I could see his face illuminated by the light of his dashboard. He was handsome, but there was something off about him. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his gaze made me feel like he could see right through me. When I got into his truck, the encounter started like any other. I put on my best smile and tried to make small talk to put him at ease. But then he pulled out a gun and everything changed in an instant. He told me about all the other whores that he had killed all over the country and how he enjoyed doing it. I begged for my life, tried to talk about my childhood to humanize myself, but he just laughed. I felt my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I could feel the cold metal of the gun pressed against my temple. I was sure that this was it, that I was going to die in that truck. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. But then something miraculous happened. The truck hit a pothole and the gun slipped from Jack Burton's hand. I seized the opportunity and managed to open the door and jump out of the truck. I was soaking wet and my clothes were torn, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back until I was sure I was safe. I never saw Jack Burton again, and as far as I know, he was never caught. But that encounter changed me in ways that I could never have predicted. It made me realize that life is precious and that I didn't want to waste it anymore. It made me quit prostitution, get an education, and start a new life for myself. Looking back on that terrifying experience, I learned a valuable lesson that I think can apply to anyone's life. We should never take our lives for granted and always be mindful of the dangers that lurk around us. It's easy to get caught up in the routine of our everyday lives and forget how fragile we truly are. But if we can take the time to appreciate the moments we have, to cherish the people we love, and to be vigilant in the face of danger, we can make the most of our lives and avoid the pitfalls that can lead us astray. So that's my story. It's not one that I like to think about, but it's one that has shaped who I am today. I hope that my experience can serve as a cautionary tale to others, and that they can learn from my mistakes and triumphs. Life is a journey, and it's up to us to make the most of it. My mother, the killer. I never suspected my mother, not for a second. It never crossed my mind that she could be capable of doing the things she did. I was the youngest of 3 children, and I had always been the one closest to her. She would always say that I was her favorite, and I believed her. We were so close that I couldn't imagine her ever hurting me or anyone else in the family. It all started with my father. He had been sick for a while, and we all assumed it was just his health deteriorating with age. But then he passed away suddenly, and the autopsy revealed that he had been poisoned with a lethal dose of arsenic. We were all in shock, but my mother was devastated. She cried and cried, and I remember feeling so sorry for her. Then my sister died. She was a healthy young woman, but she started experiencing strange symptoms that the doctors couldn't diagnose. It wasn't until after she died that they discovered she had been poisoned with cyanide. It was like lightning had struck twice. My mother was inconsolable, and I couldn't bear to see her in so much pain. And then my other brother died. He had always been the black sheep of the family, but he was still my brother. He died in his sleep, and the autopsy showed that he had been poisoned with a deadly cocktail of drugs. That's when the police started to suspect foul play. I still remember the day the police came to our house. They asked us all sorts of questions, and I could tell that they were suspicious of my mother. But I defended her. I told them that she would never hurt us. It wasn't until they found the evidence that I was forced to accept the truth. My mother had been slowly poisoning us all for years. She had been slipping poison into our food and drinks, and we had no idea. I couldn't believe it. It was like living in a nightmare. How could the person I loved most in the world do something like this? The police finally caught up with her after years of evading arrest. She had changed her identity multiple times and had even faked the death of one of her alternate identities. But they finally caught her, and she was put on trial for several counts of first-degree murder. It was a media sensation, and our family was in the spotlight. I remember the day I had to testify against my own mother. I sat in the witness stand, staring at her as she stared back at me. But all that I could detect was an extreme hollowness. It was like she wasn't even there. And when the verdict came in, I felt relief, but also a deep sense of loss. It wasn't just my family that she had taken from me, but also my childhood. I remembered all those times she had made me sign life insurance forms without explaining what they were, and I started to question the validity of the love that I had always thought I felt from her. Had it all been a lie? Even now, years later, I find it difficult to find peace or solace in my memories with her. I miss my family, but I can't help but wonder what could have been if my mother had been someone else entirely. It's a painful lesson, but one that I think we can all take away from this. Never take those closest to you for granted, and always be vigilant of those who seem too good to be true. Russian invasion. I was just an ordinary 13-year-old boy living in Ukraine. My life was filled with simple pleasures like playing football with my friends and helping my grandfather tend to his garden. But then the world turned upside down, and I lost everything that I held dear. The Russian army invaded my country, and my childhood was shattered forever. The Russian invasion was like a dark cloud that descended upon my country, blotting out the sunshine and happiness of everyday life. The streets were filled with soldiers, tanks, and heavy artillery, and the air was thick with fear and uncertainty. We never knew when the Russians would come knocking on our door, forcing us to abandon our homes and flee for our lives. But one event stands out in my mind as the most traumatic experience of my life. It was a warm summer evening, and my neighborhood was quiet and peaceful. Suddenly we heard the sound of automatic gunfire and explosions down the street, and we knew that the Russians had arrived. A group of soldiers entered our neighborhood, and they began to round up the occupants of each house, forcing them to gather in the middle of the street. It was like a scene from a nightmare, with people crying and screaming as they were herded like cattle. But then something happened that I will never forget. A baby in one of the houses started to cry, and a Russian soldier yanked it from its mother's arms. He stomped on the baby viciously until it stopped making any noise. The crowd was then doused in gasoline and lit on fire. I will never forget the sound of teeth popping as the people burned alive. It was like the sound of popcorn in the microwave, but far more sinister and terrifying. I wanted to run and hide, to escape the horror of the scene unfolding before me, but I was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. In that moment, I realized that the world was a cruel and brutal place, filled with darkness and evil. I lost my innocence that day, and I was forced to confront the harsh reality of war and conflict. I will never be the same again. But through it all, I learned a valuable lesson about the strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of unimaginable horror and despair, people have the capacity to persevere and find hope in the midst of darkness. The people of Ukraine are still standing strong, and we will never surrender to the forces of evil and oppression. We were just trying to help. I have always considered myself an exceptional man. I worked hard to become financially successful and have never been one to shy away from a challenge. When my wife Elizabeth told me that she wanted to find her biological family, I saw it as just another challenge to conquer. However, as time went on, I realized that the situation was far more complex than I initially anticipated. Elizabeth was adopted as an infant, and her adoptive parents had passed away, leaving her with a deep desire to know where she came from. She eventually found her half-brother, a man in his 20s with a criminal record, and felt a sense of obligation to help him get back on his feet. Despite my reservations, I agreed to support her decision and allowed her half-brother to stay with us. As the days passed, I could not help but notice the changes in my wife. She became more distant and irritable, and I could tell that the stress of the situation was taking a toll on her. She was working tirelessly to help her half-brother find a job, and I could tell that she was beginning to feel like she had bitten off more than she could chew. Then one evening everything changed. Elizabeth and I had an argument with her half-brother about his continued criminality. We had given him numerous chances to turn his life around, but he seemed intent on making the same mistakes over and over again. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a knife and attacked my wife. I can still vividly remember the details of that night, the sound of the knife slicing through her flesh, the sickening thud as her body hit the ground, and the sight of her lifeless eyes staring back at me. I was frozen in place, unable to move or even scream for help. All I could do was watch as her half-brother fled the scene. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie. The blood spattered across the walls, the overturned furniture, and the gaping wound in my wife's chest all combined to create a surreal and terrifying atmosphere. I was numb with shock and grief, unable to comprehend how such a thing could have happened to someone so kind and loving. As the days passed, I was consumed with a sense of guilt. I blamed myself for not being able to protect my wife, for not being able to see the warning signs, for not being able to prevent the tragedy that had befallen us. I knew that I would never be able to forgive myself for what had happened, and that the memory of that night would haunt me for the rest of my days. The police eventually caught the half-brother, and he was sentenced to life in prison for the murder. But it didn't bring my wife back. I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered life and try to make sense of what had happened. Through it all, I learned an important lesson. Sometimes our desires and needs can blind us to the dangers that lie ahead. We must be careful in our search for fulfillment and make sure that we don't put ourselves or our loved ones in harm's way. It's easy to get caught up in our own desires, but we must always be mindful of the possible negative consequences of all of our actions, even if they are well-intentioned.